meeting is being recorded.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Ray Rafiti. I think most of you out there know who I am, but it's been a while. So just by way of a refresher, I am the Senior Associate Director here in the Tower Center at SMU. And we are fully underway with programming this semester. And of course, as always, we have a full slate of Middle East offerings. And so it's my honor to welcome today our presenter or our conversationalist, Dr. Monicher Daraj. The program is called Rivalry for Religious Soft Power in the Muslim World, so just making sure everybody's in the right place. But Dr. Daraj is he's very well known to me as having been an undergraduate student of his just a few years ago. I'll leave it at that. He has a PhD in political science, government from the University of Texas at Austin. He's been at some place called TCU for the past 30 years for all the SMU people out there. He is a well-known person, well-known scholar in Middle Eastern studies. He is active on the lecture circuits and has delivered many speeches to universities, think tanks, community groups all over Dallas-Fort Worth and throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, and the Middle East. His service to TCU includes serving as a co-chair of Global Innovations Initiative, also the TCU Study Abroad program in Budapest, and more locally to us as a Tower Center Fellow here at SMU. So without further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Daraj and we'll get underway.
Thank you very much, Ray, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I introduce our distinguished speaker today, James Dorsey. And I want to thank everybody who is in the audience, and I'll be happy to pick your questions later after James's presentation. But let me briefly introduce James Dorsey. He's a senior fellow at Middle East Institute of the National University of Singapore. He has written several books. Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer is one of his major books. China and the Middle East, Comparative Political Transition between Southeast Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. And with Teresa Cruz, he also co-authored Shifting Sands, Essays on the Sports and Politics in the Middle East. And his forthcoming books are Civilization versus Nation State, How Illiberal Democrats, Authoritarians, and Autocrats Shape the New World Order, and the book that is basis for his lecture today, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, Religious Soft Power Rivalry in the Muslim World. Prior to entering into academia, James was an award-winning two-time Pulitzer Prize nominee, veteran journalist, who covered ethnic and religious conflict in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America for such notable outlets like Wall Street Journal and New York Times, Financial Times, Christian Science Monitor. And as he entered in the academia, James was a finalist for the European Press Prize, and he's a member of the advisory board of several journals, has worked closely with World Economic Forum, and is active in World Water Forum, and also he is active in UN Secretary General's office, has been in the past, and the United Nations Foundation for Conflict Resolution. I can go on and take more time, but I don't want to do that. So it's a delight that James Dorsey was kind enough to accept our invitation to have an audience with us. So without any further ado, I present to you James Dorsey, and the topic of his presentation is going to be on rivalry for soft power in the Islamic world and its consequences. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning in Texas, or good afternoon in Texas. Good morning in Manila, in the Philippines, where I am at the moment. Dr. Daraj, thank you very much for this invitation and for that very kind introduction. Let me start off by taking you back to 1924. Jordanian ruler at the time, Jordanian ruler Abdullah I, couldn't believe his luck when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the visionary who carved modern Turkey out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, abolished the caliphate. Abdullah was inclined to send Atatürk a congratulatory telegram. He told the Manchester Guardian, that the Caliphate is an Arab institution. The Prophet was an Arab. The Quran is in Arabic. The holy places are in Arabia. And the Caliph should be an Arab of the tribe of Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet. The Caliphate had returned to Arabia in Abdullah's mind. Fact of the matter is that it didn't. A century later, it is not the Caliphate that Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim powerhouses are fighting about. It is religious soft power to garner geopolitical influence, power, and dominance. The significance of this battle lies in what is at stake. The battle will determine which Muslim majority country or countries will be recognized as leaders of the Islamic world, and the degree to which moderate Islam incorporates principles of tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights, as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The major competitors fall into two broad categories. Proponents of a state-controlled form of Islam, whose principles are defined by the political needs of an often authoritarian or autocratic state, and advocates of an interpretation of the faith that is defined by civil society, embraces principles of humanitarianism, pluralism, human rights, and involves legal recontextualization and or reform of Islam to address problematic and discriminatory notions. It is what I would describe as a battle for the soul of Islam that pits rival Middle Eastern and Asian powers against one another. Turkey, the seat of the Islamic world's last true caliphate, that today propagates a Turkic-centric religious nationalist worldview. Saudi Arabia, home to the faith's holy cities, and the United Arab Emirates, promulgators of a militantly statist and authoritarian interpretation of Islam. Qatar, with its less strict version of Wahhabism and penchant for political Islam. Indonesia, that promotes an independent, humanitarian, and pluralistic notion of Islam that reaches out to other faiths as well as non-Muslim center-right forces across the globe. Morocco, which uses religion as a way to position itself as the face of moderate Islam. And of course, Iran, with its derailed theocratic revolutionary approach. In the ultimate analysis, no clear winner may emerge from the battle. Yet the course of the complex religious and geopolitical battle for the soul of Islam could determine the degree to which Islam will be defined by either one or more competing stripes of ultra-conservatism or statist forms of the faith that preach absolute obedience to the ruler and reduce religious establishments to pawns of the state, and in doing so perpetuate what historian Ahmed Kuru calls the alliance between the ulama and the state, as opposed to a truly more tolerant and pluralistic interpretation of one of the three Abrahamic religions. Moreover, the outcome of this is likely to play a significant role in determining the prospects for peace and security, not only in the vast region extending from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Philippines, but also in Europe and the United States. Implicit in the rivalry is a broader debate across the Muslim world that goes to the heart of the relationship between the state and religion, and what role the state, if at all, should play in enforcement of religious morals and the place of religion in education, judicial systems, and politics. Increasingly, lines dividing the state and religion become ever more blurred the more autocratic a political system is. The history of the quest for Muslim religious soft and geopolitical power tells the story of an increasingly competitive struggle with the staggered entry of new players. Initially, the Saudis, with Egyptian, Pakistani, and a degree of West African input, had the playing field in the 1960s and 1970s more or less to themselves, as they created the building blocks of what became the world's single most focused, state-run, well-funded public diplomacy campaign. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia invested far more in the campaign than the Soviet Union or the United States allocated to their public diplomacy during the Cold War. The campaign sought to impose the kingdom's ultra-conservative, austere, and Puritan strand of the faith on Muslim communities across the globe. The Saudi effort, in contrast to that of the United States, which could rely on its private sector cultural attributes, was by necessity a top-down, largely government-financed initiative that garnered support among Muslims worldwide. The bulk of Saudi monies went to non-violent, ultra-conservative religious, cultural, and media institutions in countries stretching from China across Eurasia and Africa into the Americas. In recent years, the level of Saudi funding has significantly dropped, and the primary focus of the kingdom's religious soft power diplomacy has changed with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The drive today is to project the kingdom and its Islam as tolerant and forward-looking, rather than focusing on the past. It seeks to portray decades of Saudi support for an intolerant and supremacist Muslim worldview as an aberration of history. The current drive is designed to open doors through demonstrative acts that create the image of a progressive, cutting-edge society, rather than a harsh, inaccessible, and secretive kingdom. The February 2020 visit to the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz in Poland by a delegation of 25 prominent Muslim clergymen, led by Mohammed al-Issa, the head of the Muslim World League, and the group's forging of alliances with Jewish and evangelical communities serve that purpose. Once a prime vehicle of Saudi global promotion of religious ultra-conservatism, Prince Mohammed has turned the League into a propagator of his vaguely defined notion of a moderate Islam. Saudi Arabia's significant retreat from religiously packaged foreign funding of Saudi Muslim ultra-conservatism has created opportunities for the kingdom's competitors. It also, as I will explore a little later, forced the kingdom to attempt to co-opt those seeking to advance a more pluralistic and truly tolerant Islam that involves jurisprudential reform and an unrestricted endorsement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because they pose a challenge to what amounts to the kingdom's self-serving endeavor. Time will tell whether co-optation works. Moreover, facts on the ground in the kingdom and beyond call into question the extent of Saudi moderation and the degree to which it is structurally cemented. Reform in the kingdom involves carefully managed, genuine social change, but does not amount to a wholesale repudiation of long-standing Islamic jurisprudence that embraces obsolete, outdated, and supremacist concepts. Significant reforms, such as subjugation of the kingdom's ultra-conservative religious establishment, greater rights and opportunities for women, and the creation of an entertainment industry, were driven by Prince Mohammed's perceived political requirements, as well as the economic and social building blocks needed for diversification of the Saudi economy. They were at best anchored in rulings of hardly independent courts, issued in line with government policy, rather than in sweeping reinterpretation of religious law that would redefine Islamic jurisprudence as such. The government, in its bid to create a 21st century economy, has stressed the importance of non-religious education, with an emphasis on science and languages. Yet the removal from school books of supremacist and racist concepts and language since the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks has proven to be a slow and torturous process. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom reported 5 years after King Salman's accession to the throne that despite progress in recent years, Saudi textbooks have seen some backsliding regarding language noting hatred and violence toward non-Muslims. More recently, the Israel-based textbook watchdog Impact SE gave Saudi Arabia a more positive rating. Prince Mohammed's embrace of religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue has produced frequent interactions with Jewish and Christian leaders, but not led to a lifting of the ban on public non-Muslim worship and the building of non-Muslim houses of worship in the kingdom itself. Access to the holy sites like Mecca and Medina remains off limits for non-Muslims, while their entry into mosques is often barred. This week, a Muslim man was arrested for dedicating his pilgrimage to Mecca to the deceased Queen Elizabeth because she was a non-Muslim. Similarly, the kingdom, despite its designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, has continued to work with the group, for example, in Southeast Asia. The battle for the soul of Islam accelerated with the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The battle grew significantly more complex in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, with the additional focus on the fight against transnational jihadists. More recently, the emphasis has shifted in competing efforts by multiple Middle Eastern and Asian Muslim majority states that, in their bid to garner religious soft power, either support or oppose not only violent, but also non-violent expressions of political Islam, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Tablighi Jamaat. Each of the primary actors in this struggle seeks to impose their definition of how the faith should govern the religious and political life of believers across the globe. The struggle is occurring against the backdrop of a world in which the embrace of religious belief and the rise of nationalism and populism reflect the widespread disintegration of norms, values, and traditional worldviews that historically serve to anchor individuals and provide meaning to their lives. Policymakers often concentrate on distinct policies and measures enacted by various major players. Most recently, these include Saudi Arabia's lifting of bans that restricted women's and social and economic mobility, the United Arab Emirates' emphasis on tolerance and individual social rights, as well as its establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel, the focus on interfaith dialogue by some of the contenders for religious soft power, and containment of perceived threats from nonviolent expressions of political Islam, first and foremost among which the Brotherhood. This includes a Saudi and UAE focus on countries like Turkey and Iran that propagate a politicized interpretation of the faith, despite recent developments in diplomatic relations. The Islamic Revolution in Iran marked the moment that Saudi funding no longer was in a class of its own. The revolution heralded a new phase in Saudi-Iranian rivalry that has engulfed the Middle East, North Africa, and the non-Arab Muslim world, as well as the international community. Competition for religious soft power is a fixture of the rivalry. So is the difference in Saudi and Iranian concepts of religious soft power, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. Both approaches have sectarian traits. Saudi Arabia's thrust, driven by geopolitics, was, with few exceptions, designed to garner religious influence. Iran, on the other hand, focused on hard power in various Arab countries in which it supported religious militants. In Africa and Asia, however, Iran struck a different note, by targeting religious communities and emphasizing spiritual and social issues. The Iranian approach was shaped by a shift in Iran as a result of the Iran-Iraq war, from revolutionary religious zeal to Iranian nationalism. This was evident in emotive debates in parliament about the utility of the occupation of the US embassy in Tehran at a time that Iran was at war with Iraq. Men like Hojatollah Islam Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Speaker of the Parliament who later became president, Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, the number 2 in the Iranian political hierarchy at the time, and Chief Jurist Ayatollah Sadegh Khalkhali, who was known as the hanging judge for his penchant for the death penalty, argued unsuccessfully in favor of a quick resolution of the embassy crisis so that Iran could focus on the defense of its territory and revolution. The debate signaled a shift from what was initially an ideological rivalry to a geopolitical fight that continues today with a religious soft and hard power strategy, driven by the perception that the United States and the Gulf states were seeking to topple the Islamic regime. If the first phase of the battle for the soul of Islam was the initially largely uncontested Saudi religious soft power effort, and the second phase involved the emergence of an Iranian revolutionary competitor, the third and most recent phase is the most complex one, not only with the arrival of new players, but also because it involves rivalries within rivalries. The new players are first and foremost the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Indonesia, whose entry further conflates religious soft power and geopolitics with nationalism and the tug of war over values, such as various freedoms, rights, and preferred political systems. The third phase is complicated by the fact that Iran's coupling of political and religious soft and hard power, that often involves recruitment of mercenaries and proxies, has, with the exception of Indonesia's approach, become the norm. That was evident with the Saudi-UAE military intervention in Libya, Emirati, Egyptian, and Turkish support for both opposing sides in Libya's civil war, and Gulf state and Turkish involvement in Syria. Even with the recent rapprochement among regional rivals, it remains the norm in various countries, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. Finally, the third phase lays bare the fact that employing notions of a moderate and tolerant Islam to garner religious soft power frequently is at best narrowly tailored to cater to the needs of public diplomacy as well as the requirements of economic reform. Various of the rivals failed to fully implement at home principles of political, social, and religious tolerance, pluralism, gender equality, and human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They also refrained from embedding these principles in a bid for recontextualization of Islamic jurisprudence as a building block for peace and stability. This enables an autocratic form of Islam that is socially liberal, but politically supports the principle of absolute obedience to the ruler. The rise of political Islam, particularly as a result of the 2011 popular Arab revolts that toppled leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen, fueled the worst fears of men like Saudi Prince Mohammed, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. The revolts persuaded the UAE, a country that prides itself on being a cutting-edge home to people from some 190 countries, to adopt a two-pronged strategy. While projecting itself as an open and tolerant society at the forefront of Islamic moderation and tolerance, respect for religious diversity, and interfaith dialogue, the UAE, together with Saudi Arabia, lobbied in Western capitals for crackdowns on expressions of non-violent political Islam, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. In doing so, it risked encouraging Islamophobia. In the Muslim world, The UAE, like Turkey and Iran, employed checkbook diplomacy and investments alongside arm twisting and military power to counter Islamists and shape religious and political environments. Speaking in 2005 to US Ambassador James Jeffrey, bin Zayed made no bones about his disdain for Salafism and Saudi ultra-conservatism. He compared Saudi Arabia's religious leaders to somebody like the one we are chasing in the mountains, a reference to Osama bin Laden, who was believed at the time to be hiding in a mountainous region of Pakistan. In an email to New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman 12 years later, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, a confidant of bin Zayed and the UAE's ambassador in Washington, asserted that Abu Dhabi fought 200 years of wars with Saudi over Wahhabism. Private Emirati scorn for Saudi Wahhabism translated in 2016 into a UAE effort to undermine Saudi religious diplomacy by sponsoring a gathering of prominent Sunni Muslim leaders in the Chechen capital of Grozny that effectively excommunicated the kingdom's interpretation of the faith. Western officials refrained from publicly commenting, but privately commended the attempt to confront a worldview that they feared provided breeding grounds for social tensions and extremism. Bin Zayed played a key role in shaping bin Salman's policies to shave off Wahhabism's rougher edges, rather than wholesale reform the kingdom's religious worldview and bring the UAE and Saudi Arabia's religious soft power endeavors closer together. His approach centered on what author Shadi Hamid calls non-political politicized Islam, or third trend in political Islam, that in the words of scholar Gregory Gauss, is tightly tied to state authority and subservient to it. Bin Zayed's efforts have paid off. Despite ruling at home with an iron fist, bin Zayed has been able to promote a state-controlled Islam that styles itself as tolerant and apolitical and preaches obedience without legally addressing outdated or intolerant concepts embedded in the faith. These include notions of kafirs or infidels, slavery, and Muslim supremacy that remain reference points even if large numbers of Muslims do not heed them. Bin Zayed's success, backed by armies of paid Western lobbyists, is evidenced by the fact that in contrast to bin Salman and Saudi Arabia's reputational problems as a result of the 2018 killing in Istanbul of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the arrests and alleged torture of dissidents, as well as anyone deemed a potential threat, the UAE is widely perceived as a religiously tolerant, pluralistic, and enlightened society. The UAE has also successfully projected itself as a secular state, even though its constitution requires legislation to be compatible with Islamic law. In doing so, UAE leaders walk a fine line. The UAE scored one of its most significant successes with the first ever papal visit to the Emirates by Pope Francis, during which he signed a document on human fraternity with Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, an ancient citadel of Islamic learning. The Pope acknowledged the UAE's growing influence when in a public address he thanked his late advisor, Egyptian Judge Mohammed Abdel Salam, who was also close to Egypt's al-Sisi, for drafting the declaration. Abdel Salam ensured that the UAE and the Egyptian president, rather than Al-Azhar, put their stamp on the document. For its part, Turkey's religious soft power drive has a raw nationalist edge to it that raises the specter of a longing for past imperial glory. Istanbul's Jamlija Mosque, Turkey's largest, inaugurated in 2019, symbolizes President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's ambitions. So does the controversial return a year later of the Hagia Sophia, the 1,500-year-old church-turned-mosque-turned-museum, to the status of a Muslim house of worship. In contrast to Ataturk, the general who converted Hagia Sophia into a museum to emphasize the alignment with the west of the state he had carved out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, Erdogan embarked on a campaign of support for mosques and Muslim communities in former imperial holdings and beyond. Erdogan's religious diplomacy follows in the footsteps of Ottoman sultans who sought legacy in grandiose mosque construction. He signaled his intention to restore Turkish glory by positioning his country as the leader of the Islamic world, willing and able to defend Muslims across the globe. His was a worldview outlined by Ahmet Davutoglu, Erdogan's one-time foreign and prime minister, who argued that Turkey's geography, history, and religious and cultural agency empowered it to be a regional hegemon. Erdogan underlined the importance of religious soft power in his geopolitical strategy by granting his Religious Affairs Department, or Diyanet, a key role in foreign and development aid policy. Established by Ataturk in 1924 to propagate a statist, moderate form of Islam that embraced secularism, Erdogan has infused the directorate with his version of political Islam. The importance Erdogan attributes to his religious diplomacy is reflected in the fact that Diyanet is budgeted in 2023 at a time of 80% plus inflation and regional turmoil, more money than ministries like trade, industry, foreign affairs, and disaster relief. Erdogan harnessed the Diyanet to legitimize his military escapades in Syria, Libya, and Iraq, in much the same way that the UAE and Iran blend hard power with religious soft power. Diyanet regularly instructs imams at home and abroad to recite a Quranic verse, Surah al-Fath, or the verse of the conquest, to legitimize the Turkish president's adventures. The surah conveys a message of victory and conquest, as well as the favor God conferred upon the Prophet Muhammad and his followers. It promises increased numbers of monotheists, as well as forgiveness of mistakes by those who do jihad on the path of God. Mosques and the dispatch of Diyanet personnel who serve as imams, religious counselors, and political commissars constitute an important pillar of a multi-pronged soft power strategy that includes development and humanitarian aid, the funding and building of infrastructure, Turkish private sector investment, and the opening of schools and universities. The meshing of religious soft power and aid has served Turkey well. Erdogan's blend of religion and nationalism has allowed him to break with Turkey's Kemalist past that firmly anchored the country in Western institutions such as NATO and the Council of Europe. It also enabled him to gradually replace Turkey's adherence to French-inspired secularism with the identification of Islam as a religious and foundational civilization that positions the country as a leading, albeit controversial, Muslim power. Erdogan rejected more cosmopolitan expressions of Turkish Islamism that embraced an umbilical cord with the West because it undermined his ability to use religion to legitimize his increasingly illiberal rule, ruptured historic continuity, and produced a shallow national identity. His strategy has paid dividends. Erdogan has emerged as the most trusted regional leader in polls that surveyed public opinion in numerous Middle Eastern and Muslim countries. In at least one poll, 40% of the respondents also recognized Erdogan as a religious authority, even though he is not an Islamic scholar. Turkey has a leg up on its competitors in the Balkans, Central Asia, and Europe. Centuries of Ottoman rule, as well as voluntary and forced migration, have spawned close ethnic and family ties. Millions of Turks pride themselves on their Balkan roots. The names of Istanbul neighborhoods, parks, and forests reflect the Balkans' Ottoman history. Central Asians identify themselves as Turkic, speak Turkic languages, and share cultural attributes and similar culinary delights with Turks. In Europe, Turkish operatives often enjoy the goodwill of large, well-integrated diaspora communities, even if the fault lines run deep between Turks and Kurds opposed to the Turkish government's repression of Kurdish cultural and political aspirations. Erdogan's Achilles heel may be that the Ottoman-style Islam he projects relies on a misreading of the empire's history. He ironically embraces a Kemalist version of the Ottomans as a religiously driven empire, rather than one that perceived itself as both Muslim and European, and that was pragmatic and not averse to aspects of secularism. That misreading has produced, in the words of Turkey scholar Sona Jaratai, an ahistorical, political Islam-oriented, and often patronizing foreign policy concoction that has informed Turkey's religious soft power strategy. Indonesia, the new kid on the block in the competition for Muslim religious soft power and leadership, has proven to be a different kettle of fish. Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim movement, rather than the government of President Joko Widodo, has emerged as a formidable rival capable of operating on the same level as states with which it competes. The Indonesian state initially took a backseat in the global competition. It benefited from its incestuous ties to Nahdlatul Ulama, as well as the movement's ability to gain access to the corridors of power in world capitals, including Washington, London, Berlin, Budapest, Brussels, the Vatican, and Delhi. Nahdlatul Ulama was instrumental in organizing a visit to Indonesia in 2020 by Pope Francis that had to be postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. It, rather than the government, invited and arranged a trip to Jakarta by then US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who made a speech to a Nahdlatul Ulama event the centerpiece of his visit. That has changed with this year's Indonesian chairmanship of the Group of 20. Indonesia hopes to make its mark with a summit of religious leaders that is scheduled to precede the meeting of heads of government and state. The summit is expected to refashion the G20's erstwhile interfaith track as the Religion 20 or R20. The R20 intends to bring together religious leaders to position religion as a source of solutions rather than problems. It is a call that resonates coming from the world's most populous Muslim majority country and democracy. Keen to tighten relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the government has ensured that the summit will be co-hosted by the Muslim World League as a major Muslim non-governmental organization, rather than representative non-Muslim organizations less beholden to a government. Fact is that the League is the Saudi Crown Prince's vehicle to garner religious soft power and help polish the kingdom's tarnished image. The League sees the invitation to co-host as legitimization by one of the world's most important Muslim civil society movements, as well as an opportunity to co-opt it. Nahdlatul Ulama may find the embrace of the League hard to square with the fact that its growing international influence and access was enabled by its embrace in 2015 of Nusantara or Archipelago Humanitarian Islam that recognizes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with no caveats. In contrast to its rivals, Nahdlatul Ulama has gone beyond paying lip service to notions of tolerance and pluralism with the issuance of jurisprudence intended to recontextualize the faith by eliminating problematic categories like infidels, the first of several such expected moves. Nahdlatul Ulama's evolution towards a process of recontextualization dates to a 1992 gathering of religious scholars chaired by Abdurrahman Wahid, the group's leader at the time and later president of Indonesia. The gathering noted that the changing context of reality necessitates the creation of new interpretations of Islamic law and orthodox Islamic teaching. Nahdlatul Ulama's ability to compete is evident in the increasingly influential role that it plays in the Central Democratic International, or CDI, the world's largest alliance of political parties that grew out of an alliance of European and Latin American Christian Democrats, and today groups ruling parties across the globe. CDI's executive committee includes top German officials, controversial Central European government leaders, including Viktor Orban of Hungary, as well as some European and Latin America's most prominent politicians and former leaders. Nahdlatul Ulama's sway was evident in a resolution that was adopted at a meeting of the CDI Executive Committee in January 2020 in Yogyakarta that was wholly Nahdlatul Ulama thinking and language. The resolution called for the rule of law, adherence to universal ethics and humanitarian values based on Western humanism, Christian democracy, and Nahdlatul Ulama's concept of humanitarian Islam. The resolution urged CDI to push for a world based on those principles, to counter the emergence of authoritarian, civilizationist states that do not accept the rules-based post-World War II order, whether in terms of human rights, rule of law, democracy, or respect for international borders and the sovereignty of other nations. Neither Saudi Arabia nor the UAE anticipated Nahdlatul Ulama's determination to push its concept of humanitarian Islam globally, including at the highest levels of government in Western capitals, as well as India. The degree to which Nahdlatul Ulama is perceived as a threat by the UAE and Saudi Arabia is evident in battles in high-level interfaith meetings convened by the Vatican, the State Department, and others over principles like endorsement of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. Nahdlatul Ulama's rise to prominence was also what persuaded Al-Issa, the head of the Muslim World League, to visit the Indonesian group's headquarters in Jakarta in early 2020. It was the first visit to one of the world's foremost Islamic organizations in the League's almost 60-year history. Membership in CDI of the National Awakening Party, or PKB, the political party of Nahdlatul Ulama, gives it a leg up on the UAE and Saudi Arabia that banned parties, or Turkey, whose ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP, would be viewed as problematic at best. Nahdlatul Ulama benefits from what journalist Muhammad Abu Fadl has described as rejection of an Arab face of Islam, that in his words is hopelessly contorted by extremism in Western perceptions. Abu Fadl suggested that certain elements in the West have become interested in Asian Islam, which appears to be more moderate than Arab Islam, less inclined to export radical ideology, less dominated by extremist interpretations of religion, and possessed of a genuine and sincere tendency to act with tolerance. In sum, the battle for the soul of Islam is being fought at multiple levels and across numerous platforms, ranging from the world's corridors of power to mosques and villages in the Indonesian countryside, to efforts to win hearts and minds in countries with young populations whose attitudes towards religion and religiosity are changing. Ultimately, these changing youth attitudes may be one factor determining the outcome of the battle for the soul of Islam. Thank you, and I look forward to a discussion as well as questions and answers.
Thank you very much for that very thoughtful, comprehensive, and penetrating analysis. You really gave us a holistic picture of the different trends and the way that they manifest themselves for a struggle for the soul of Islam and the heritage. I have a couple of questions to break the ice and to start us off, and then I'm going to go to the audience and discuss and their questions and comments. I'm interested in challenges that Saudi Arabia may face. As you aptly mentioned, during the Cold War, they outspent United States and Soviet Union propagating their vision of Islam. And this is the period after the 1973 oil embargo and increasing income of oil, and they have the assets to propagate their vision of Wahhabi Islam and all of that. How do you see that as one challenge in post-carbon era as increasing energy transition that we are seeing and call for on governments to get away from fossil fuel and invest more on renewable energy and all that, how that may impact that fortune? The second challenge that I think this is part of one question that Saudis would face, why they draw legitimacy from the two holy sites of Muslims to be on their soil, but at the same time, Wahhabi Islam, as you well know, is not something that is sought after beyond the Wahhabi world of, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. Majority of Muslims do not embrace it and do not look upon it as mainstream Islam. So Saudis have that baggage in universalizing their version of Islam as well. And closely related to this is the appeal of populist Islam, politicization of Islam that we have witnessed in the last 30, 40 years has made populist Islam versus Saudi establishment Islam much more receptive for the youth around the world. So that's one question. The second question that I have, the picture that I get from your presentation is that what we have and what we are going to have in the immediate future is a fragmented Islamic world in which different powers vying for different interpretation of Islam and attempt to universalize that Islam in order to proselytize and in order to win hearts and minds in the majority Muslim countries. But, the appeal of Indonesian Islam to youth beyond Indonesia, many youth in other parts of the Muslim world long for human rights, long for democratic governance, accountability, embracement of an order that does not embrace extremism, what Indonesian refer to Arab Islam that has given us ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other sorts of extremism, and the fact that two countries supported Taliban when they first came to power in Afghanistan, UAE and Saudi Arabia. So it seems that fragmentation and Iran that is very much into spreading Shia Islam and its brand of populist Islam, and what you aptly mentioned about Turkey and its brand of more moderate Islam. So this fragmentation would then may further disintegrate the Islamic world around the pursuit of creating a single universal Islam driven by pan-Islamism that would give them sway over Muslims in other parts of the world. We're going to have many Islams geographically defined and theologically and politically also articulated in a very different language with very different appeal to very different sectors of population, not only in their part of the world, but also globally in the larger Islamic world. Your reaction to this?
Sure. Okay. Let me start off with the first question, which I think I had a little bit difficulty hearing, which I think broke down into three parts. One was the U.S.-Saudi relationship, particularly as it regarded U.S. support, in a sense, for Saudi Arabia, also in terms of its religious interpretation of Islam. The second part of it, if I'm not incorrect, was the receptibility of Wahhabism as such, and the third was the rise of what you described as populist Islam.
That, in addition, what's going to happen when Saudi oil income in future may not loom so large and give them the asset to spread their message of Islam?
I think there are several factors here. First of all, let's keep in mind that this quest for moderate Islam is part of the fallout of the 9/11 attacks. Suddenly you had these attacks. The image of Islam was the falling World Trade Towers. And particularly the Saudis obviously had a problem because a majority of the perpetrators of those attacks were Saudi nationals. So, and the United States was talking about, was not basically blaming Islam, but was talking about Islamism as a religion of peace and so on. And Muslim countries needed to respond to that. And ultimately, if prior to 9/11, in some ways, Saudi ultra-conservatism or Saudi-backed ultra-conservatism was not unwelcome in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, that clearly post 9/11 had flipped. And what I think you saw was a gradual, very gradual shift in emphasis on the part of the kingdom and the kingdom's rulers that really, you had interfaith initiatives by King Abdullah and what have you, but it really took off with the rise of the Salmans, both the king and the crown prince for that matter. And that links into, in a sense, your other part of the question, or your third part of the question, as well as the second part, which is that what you have with Mohammed bin Salman, whatever you think of him, is a leader in his 30s who understands on an intuitive level a majority of the population that is below 30. He understands the modes of communication. Keep in mind that MISC, the foundation that he runs to support the arts, and he is essentially used to co-opt the arts in the kingdom, predates his rise. In that sense, he was very perceptive. He also understands that the reliance on fossil fuels, even if we may get a boost as a result of Ukraine and so on and so forth, long term is not going to guarantee the survival of the regime. And in this case, given his age, his survival, most probably. And that he is going to have to liberalize socially, and diversify the economy and create opportunity. And I think his survival, his future rests on his ability to do so. Now, coming back to religion, I think there are two things here to keep in mind. One is that, yes, Wahhabism was not the most popular strand of Islam, but the funding did have impact. It certainly had impact in countries like Pakistan. It had impact in other parts of the Muslim world. It had impact to a degree among Muslim minority communities. I would argue that in terms of the Saudi funding, you had two vested interests. You had the clergy, which clearly was about spreading a specific interpretation of the faith, but at the same time was willing to make compromises to accommodate the government's needs and the ruling family's needs. And for the ruling families, this was primarily, certainly post 1979, this was about Iran. And it didn't really matter to them what version of ultra-conservatism you were going to embrace, as long as it was anti-Shia and anti-Iran. That's really what counted. And so the impact of Wahhabism in that sense was not just purely religious, it was also sectarian. let me go to your third point on your first question, which is, I think the key here is this. The fallout of the 2011 Arab revolts, the fallout of mismanagement by Arab regimes, and to some degree, one I guess has to exclude the Gulf regimes, since there's been a great deal of progress and social and economic development, but basically, what you're seeing among youth is no longer willing or interested in a ritualistic interpretation of the faith, or of any faith for that matter, a much more individual relationship, and a questioning of authority, not only temporal political authority, but also religious authority. And so that's what I think leaders are going to have to respond to. Now, with regard to your second question about fragmentation, frankly, first of all, I think the Islamic world was always fragmented, and faith, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, are big tents under which multiple, sometimes opposing strands of thought or strands of belief exist. So in that sense, the battle for the soul of Islam doesn't change anything fundamentally. That fragmentation existed. Nor do I think that the battle for the soul of Islam, as I'm portraying it, is an effort to get a unified Muslim world. I think what it is and you may have multiple strands in that. It's a battle about geopolitics. It's a battle about regional hegemony. It's a battle about, in a world of diplomacy, in which diplomacy no longer is guys in pinstripe suits with a glass of champagne at a reception. It's sports, it's cultural, it's public, it's religious. So it's a battle in that field. And it's a battle in which very fundamental questions are raised, whereby obviously the text of the Quran is the text of the Quran perceived as God's word. So that's an untouchable. But jurisprudence are the rules according to which you live. And if you still have for example, a recognition of slavery as something legitimate in your body of law, by definition, reform is needed. And so I think that's what this is about. And it's about the values that will inform that recontextualization of the faith. In some ways, and I don't like the term, and certainly not as it's applied to the war in Ukraine, but in some ways it is a battle of autocracy versus democracy.
Thank you so much. Ray and Cora, do we have a discussant at this point, or shall I go to the questions of the audience? Please advise. I don't know if they're there. I'm going to go.
So I'm here. So, Manager, sorry, we have to do a hard stop right at 6. Unfortunately, that was the program was from 5 to 6, and we are at 5:59. So, unfortunately, we don't have a discussant or aren't able to take any more questions at this time, just due to the time constraints that we have, which I apologize for, but that's where we're at.
Not a problem. We have only really 2 questions here, but that's fine. I hope I covered some of the questions of the audience. Our apologies to the audience members, but we definitely benefited immensely from James's insight, sharing with us early the content of his book, and we look forward to having an audience with you in future, James, in other venues. Thank you
It
so
would be
much.
my pleasure.
Thank you very much. I
Thank
appreciate
you
the
so
time.
much to you for your presentation, for everyone for their participation, and good day to all.
Thank you very much for having me, and all the best. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Hope
you
to
too.
see you soon.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.